His secret grudge against John Wayne exploded behind the scenes. Lee Van Cleef was born on January 9, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey. He wasn't born into show business aristocracy or discovered lounging by a Beverly Hills pool. His early life was grounded in the reality of working-class America. His parents, Clarence and Marion, hailed from Dutch ancestry. Young Clarence Jr. grew up in a time of hardship, the Great Depression, leaving its mark on families across the nation. He worked on farms in his youth, physical labor shaping his lean frame and perhaps instilling a certain toughness. His distinctive features, that sharp, angular nose, the piercing, close-set eyes, were not considered traditionally handsome by Hollywood standards of the time. He didn't possess the square jaw of a leading man or the smooth charm of a matinee idol. Instead, his face seemed designed for the shadows, for portraying characters who lived on the fringes of society. Before finding his way to the silver screen, Van Cleef served his country. He joined the U.S. Navy in 1942, during the height of World War II, serving as a sonarman aboard a submarine chaser. This period of military service undoubtedly added another layer to his already resilient character, exposing him to discipline and danger. After the war, he briefly worked as an accountant, a far cry from the dramatic roles that would make him famous. But the pull of performance, perhaps sparked by his unique look and a natural intensity, began to take hold. He started acting in local stage productions, refining his presence, honing his ability to command attention without saying a word. It was on the stage that the seed of his acting career was truly planted, a seed that would eventually bloom in the most unexpected landscapes. Lee Van Cleef's path to Hollywood was not a straight line. It was a winding road filled with detours, frustrations, and the constant struggle for recognition. His distinctive appearance, while a hindrance to conventional leading roles, became his calling card for villainous parts. He was the perfect guy to play the outlaw, the henchman, the cold-blooded killer who met a swift, violent end. He made his film debut in 1952 in the classic Western High Noon. His role? Barely a role at all. He was one of the three members of Frank Miller's gang, the trio waiting at the train station for their leader. He had no lines. He simply stood there, his face adding to the atmosphere of menace. This was the reality of Lee Van Cleef's early Hollywood career, being typecast as the silent, sinister figure, often listed in the credits simply as villain or bad guy. He appeared in dozens of films throughout the 1950s, primarily westerns and crime dramas. Titles like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Kansas City Confidential, and Gunfight at the OK Corral. He shared the screen with some of the biggest stars of the era, Glenn Ford, Randolph Scott, Kirk Douglas, and yes, even John Wayne. But he was always in the background, a memorable face in a forgettable part. He honed his craft, learning the rhythm of film acting. But his ambition was constantly checked by the limitations imposed by his unique look and the industry's rigid casting system. The struggle wasn't just professional, it was personal. He dealt with the frustrations of a stalled career, the financial insecurity, and the feeling of being undervalued. The late 1950s and early 1960s were particularly tough. Roles became scarcer. He even considered leaving acting altogether, taking on other odd jobs to make ends meet. Then came a devastating blow. In 1960, Lee Van Cleef was involved in a serious car accident. He suffered severe injuries, including a broken leg that doctors initially thought might require amputation. The recovery was long and painful, leaving him with a permanent limp and casting serious doubt on his ability to continue the physically demanding work often required in westerns and action films. It seemed his Hollywood dream, already flickering, might be extinguished entirely. He was in a dark place, his career at a standstill, his body broken. The future looked bleak. But fate, as it often does in the most dramatic stories, had other plans for Lee Van Cleef. His darkest hour coincided with the rise of a new wave in filmmaking, a cinematic revolution happening far from the Hollywood hills, the spaghetti western, and its visionary architect, Sergio Leone, was searching for faces unlike any others, faces etched with experience, morality as gray as the desert dust, characters who blurred the lines between good and evil. Leone had seen Van Cleef in his small, often silent roles, and he recognized the raw, untapped potential in that unforgettable face. Leone offered Van Cleef a role in his second Western, following the groundbreaking A Fistful of Dollars. The film was For a Few Dollars More, released in 1965. The role was Colonel Douglas Mortimer, the elegant, calculating bounty hunter seeking revenge. It was a revelation. For the first time, Van Cleef wasn't just a henchman. He was a co-lead, an equal to the rising star Clint Eastwood. He was given lines, depth, and a chance to showcase a charisma and complexity no one in Hollywood had ever allowed him. His performance was captivating, sharp, intelligent, and deadly. The film was a massive success, especially in Europe. Suddenly, Lee Van Cleef, the perennial background villain, was a star. Leone immediately cast him again in his next film, the masterpiece that would solidify the genre and his reputation, The Good, The Bad and the Ugly, 1966. This time, Van Cleef played the chillingly ruthless Angel Eyes, the bad. It's perhaps his most iconic performance, a portrayal of pure, pragmatic evil that remains terrifyingly compelling. His presence dominated the screen, his cold efficiency making him the perfect foil for Eastwood's Good and Eli Wallach's Ugly. These two films catapulted Lee Van Cleef to international stardom. He became a sought-after leading man in the spaghetti western genre, starring in films like The Big Gundown, Death Rides a Horse, and Sabata. He was no longer just the bad guy who dies in the first reel. He was a complex figure, sometimes still a villain, sometimes an anti-hero, often the grizzled mentor or the cunning strategist. He was an icon of a genre that redefined the Western for a new generation, embracing violence, moral ambiguity, and stylistic flair in a way Hollywood traditionalists could only scoff at. While Lee Van Cleef was forging his legend in The Italian Son, his personal life, like many in Hollywood, had its share of ups and downs. He was married several times, each marriage bringing its own complexities and challenges. His first marriage to Patsy Ruth Cale produced 3 children. Subsequent marriages also saw the formation of blended families. These personal relationships, though not as publicly scrutinized as those of major Hollywood leading men of the era, were the backdrop to his professional life, providing moments of joy and stability, as well as inevitable domestic pressures. But to truly understand the alleged animosity between Lee Van Cleef and John Wayne, we must place them firmly within the context of the Western genre itself and the fundamental divide that emerged in the 1960s. John Wayne was, and remains, the embodiment of the traditional American Western. From his breakthrough in Stagecoach to epics like The Searchers and Rio Bravo, Wayne represented the values of the American frontier as depicted by Hollywood for decades. Rugged individualism, clear-cut morality, patriotism, and a certain straightforward, often idealized view of justice and manifest destiny. Wayne was the Duke, a figure so intertwined with the genre that he was the Western for many. He worked within the established studio system, alongside legendary directors like John Ford, upholding the traditions that had defined Hollywood for generations. He was a towering, often imposing figure, both on screen and off, known for his conservative political views and his vocal opinions on filmmaking and actors he admired, or didn't. Lee Van Cleef, particularly after his European breakthrough, became the face of something entirely different. The spaghetti westerns, with their operatic violence, ambiguous heroes, stylized visuals, and often cynical view of human nature and authority, were a radical departure. They were raw, gritty, and challenged the very foundations of the traditional Western mythos. Van Cleef, with his non-traditional look and his portrayals of morally complex, often amoral characters, was the perfect anti-icon for this anti-Western. He found his fame outside the Hollywood establishment that had largely dismissed him. This fundamental difference in their cinematic homes, their public images, and even perhaps their personal philosophies, set the stage for potential conflict. It wasn't just about 2 actors in the same genre. It was about 2 opposing forces, 2 competing visions of the Western, and perhaps 2 very different types of men. And it was within this brewing storm of professional and stylistic divergence that the seeds of Lee Van Cleef's reported intense dislike for John Wayne took root and flourished. So, why the deep-seated animosity? Why did Lee Van Cleef reportedly harbor such a profound hatred for John Wayne? The reasons are not simple, and they aren't just based on professional rivalry. They stem from a complex interplay of personal slights, fundamental disagreements, and perhaps a clash of 2 formidable, yet very different egos. While Lee Van Cleef himself was a relatively private man, the stories, the anecdotes circulating within the industry, and the known facts of their limited interactions paint a compelling, if uncomfortable, picture. This wasn't just casual dislike. According to those who knew Van Cleef, it bordered on the visceral. Now, piecing together the evidence and the whispers, we can reveal the likely reasons. There is one undeniable historical fact. Lee Van Cleef and John Wayne worked together on the same film, the John Ford classic, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, released in 1962. At this point in his career, John Wayne was already the Duke, a superstar of immense stature, a legend working with another legend, John Ford. Lee Van Cleef, on the other hand, was still largely unknown, struggling to find significant roles after his accident. His part in the film was small, uncredited, and again, without dialogue. He played a member of the posse. While the film is celebrated, what allegedly transpired on the set between Wayne and Van Cleef is one of the primary theories behind the animosity. Hollywood sets, especially those led by figures like John Ford and starring powerful personalities like John Wayne, could be hierarchical and, at times, dismissive of minor players. John Wayne, while revered by many, also had a reputation for being imposing, opinionated, and, according to some accounts, capable of being dismissive or even arrogant towards those he deemed less important or less talented than himself. Sources close to Van Cleef, and anecdotes that have circulated within the Western film community for years, suggest that Wayne treated Van Cleef with noticeable disdain on the set of Liberty Valance. Van Cleef was a struggling actor, recovering from a major accident, trying to get back on his feet. Wayne was at the zenith of his career. It's easy to imagine the contrast in their positions. The stories claim that Wayne didn't just ignore Van Cleef, he actively seemed to belittle him, perhaps with a condescending remark about his appearance, his small role, or even a dismissive wave or comment in front of others. One version of the story, recounted by those who claim to have heard it from Van Cleef or his close associates, suggests Wayne made a cutting remark about Van Cleef's face or his future in the industry, something to the effect that he was only good for playing dead bodies or being in the background. While no direct, verifiable quote has ever surfaced in print from Van Cleef himself confirming this exact incident, the persistence of this anecdote across various reports and biographies points to a widely held belief within their circle that something happened on that set that deeply wounded Van Cleef's pride. Remember, Lee Van Cleef had a quiet intensity, a self-respect forged through hardship. Being openly disrespected or mocked by a towering figure like John Wayne, particularly at a low point in his career, would have been a profound insult. This wasn't just professional criticism. It was a personal slight from a dominant figure in the very industry Van Cleef was fighting to stay in. For a man like Van Cleef, this perceived act of arrogance and contempt from the Duke could have easily festered into deep-seated resentment. It wasn't just an unpleasant day at work. It was an early, defining negative interaction with the man who represented everything Van Cleef was not: the insider, the golden boy, the seemingly effortless success. This moment on the set of Liberty Valance is widely believed to be the genesis of the bad blood, the spark that ignited a lasting animosity. If the Liberty Valance incident was the spark, John Wayne's public stance on spaghetti westerns was the fuel that turned resentment into burning hatred. As Lee Van Cleef's career soared in Italy with Sergio Leone's films, the spaghetti western genre exploded in popularity worldwide, challenging the dominance and perhaps even the definition of the traditional American western. John Wayne was famously unimpressed, even openly hostile, towards this new style of filmmaking. He saw it as cheap, overly violent, and morally bankrupt. He represented the classic, heroic narrative, where good triumphs over evil cleanly. The spaghetti westerns, with their anti-heroes, brutal violence, and morally ambiguous landscapes, were, in his eyes, a perversion of the genre he embodied. Wayne made numerous public statements expressing his disdain. He reportedly called the films phony, unrealistic, sick, or simply crap. He criticized their style, their violence, and their often cynical tone. While he didn't always name individual actors, his blanket dismissal of the entire genre was, for Lee Van Cleef, an unforgivable insult. Consider Van Cleef's position. He had been overlooked, underestimated, and relegated to bit parts in Hollywood for years. The spaghetti westerns, spearheaded by a director like Leone who saw his potential, didn't just give him roles. They gave him a career. international fame, respect, and financial security he had never known. Films like For a Few Dollars More and The Good, The Bad and the Ugly weren't just jobs. They were the vehicles for his rebirth as a star, the culmination of years of struggle and perseverance. When John Wayne, the biggest name in the Western world, publicly trashed the very films that made Lee Van Cleef a star, it wasn't just a difference of opinion on filmmaking style. It was a direct attack on Van Cleef's greatest professional achievement. It was as if Wayne was saying, "The films that made you famous are garbage, and by extension, your success in them is meaningless." Accounts from people who worked with Van Cleef during this period suggest he was deeply offended and angered by Wayne's comments. He saw them as arrogant and dismissive, coming from a man who had never faced the kind of struggles he had endured. A man who had been handed the keys to the kingdom while Van Cleef had to build his own palace brick by painful brick, often in a foreign land. Wayne's criticism wasn't seen as constructive feedback. It was interpreted as a deliberate attempt to diminish the significance of the spaghetti westerns and, consequently, the achievements of its stars, including Van Cleef. This public, ongoing denigration of the genre that saved Van Cleef's career only solidified and deepened the resentment that may have begun years earlier on a dusty film set. It reinforced Van Cleef's perception of Wayne as an arrogant, out-of-touch figure who looked down on anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of what a Western, or a star, should be. Beyond professional slights and criticisms of his work, a more fundamental reason for Lee Van Cleef's reported dislike for John Wayne might lie in the vast differences in their personalities, lifestyles, and perhaps even their political and social views. John Wayne was a staunch conservative, known for his outspoken patriotism and traditional values. He embodied a certain type of American masculinity, strong, unwavering, often resistant to change. He was a larger-than-life figure, both on and off-screen, who often seemed to play himself. His public persona was intertwined with his political beliefs, making him a cultural, not just cinematic, icon. Lee Van Cleef, while not as overtly political in public, had a different kind of toughness. His grit came from overcoming adversity, from being an outsider. He wasn't the clean-cut hero. He was the survivor, the man who had seen the darker side of life. His roles often required a more nuanced, less openly moralistic approach. While details of his personal political views are less public, it's plausible that a man who made his name playing morally complex characters and thriving in a genre that subverted American myths might not align perfectly with Wayne's more rigid, conservative worldview. Industry insiders and friends of Van Cleef sometimes hinted at a fundamental incompatibility between the two men. Wayne was the product of the Hollywood system, a part of the establishment. Van Cleef was the outsider who succeeded despite it. Wayne commanded respect through sheer force of personality and status. Van Cleef earned it through quiet competence and a unique, hard-won gravitas. It's easy to imagine how their paths might cross at industry events or social gatherings, leading to awkward interactions or even subtle clashes. Wayne was known to hold court, expressing his strong opinions freely. Van Cleef, while perhaps more reserved, was not someone to back down if he felt disrespected or fundamentally disagreed with something. Anecdotes, though scarce and difficult to verify specifically between these two, often paint a picture of Hollywood social circles where different camps existed, divided by style, success, and ideology. One can speculate that beyond the professional sphere, their personal interactions, however brief, revealed a fundamental incompatibility in their characters. Perhaps Wayne's perceived arrogance extended to other aspects of his personality that grated on Van Cleef. Perhaps Van Cleef's quiet intensity was misread by Wayne. The clash wasn't just about acting styles or film genres. It was possibly about two fundamentally different men who simply did not like each other, exacerbated by the professional context. The difference in their journeys. Wayne's steady rise as the quintessential hero versus Van Cleef's arduous climb as the definitive villain anti-hero likely fueled an underlying tension that made any perceived slight or disagreement between them feel magnified. This deeply rooted clash of personalities and possibly conflicting worldviews added another significant layer to the complex reasons behind Lee Van Cleef's reported utter hatred for John Wayne. After his explosive success in spaghetti westerns, Lee Van Cleef continued to work steadily throughout the 1970s and into the 80s, both in Europe and back in Hollywood, often in action and western roles that capitalized on his established image. He starred in films like Captain Apache, Escape from New York, and various European productions. However, the physical toll of his earlier life and the accident began to catch up with him. He struggled with heart problems for years. Despite his health issues, he maintained a demanding work schedule. John Wayne, the object of Van Cleef's reported animosity, passed away earlier, in 1979, after a long battle with cancer. There are no widely reported public comments from Lee Van Cleef about Wayne's death, which perhaps speaks volumes about the nature of their relationship, or lack thereof. It maintained its private, unspoken tension. Lee Van Cleef's own health continued to decline in the 1980s. On December 16, 1989, just a few weeks shy of his 65th birthday, he collapsed and died from a heart attack at his home in Oxnard, California. His passing marked the end of an era, the loss of one of the most distinctive and compelling faces in the history of Western cinema. Lee Van Cleef left behind a body of work that redefined the Western anti-hero and cemented his place as an international film icon. From the silent henchman in High Noon to the cunning bounty hunter and the chilling villain in Leone's masterpieces, his journey was one of perseverance, transformation, and undeniable talent. He was the outsider who proved that charisma didn't require a clean-shaven face and that heroism could be found in the most unexpected, even morally ambiguous, characters. And the story of his reported intense dislike, his utter hatred, for John Wayne, it remains a compelling footnote in Hollywood history, a vivid illustration of the complex dynamics, the personal rivalries, and the hidden tensions that often simmer beneath the surface of Tinseltown's glamorous facade. It wasn't just a simple feud. It was a clash between two titans of the same genre who represented fundamentally different visions of the frontier and different paths to stardom. While John Wayne represented the established order, the idealized past, Lee Van Cleef, the man who rose from obscurity and a crippling accident to international fame through a revolutionary new film style, embodied the grit, the complexity, and the unexpected paths to success that Hollywood often prefers to keep hidden. The reasons for his hatred, the alleged slights on set, the public dismissal of his defining work, the clash of fundamental beliefs, paint a picture of a man whose pride was wounded, whose achievements were questioned, and who simply could not abide the figure that John Wayne represented. Lee Van Cleef's legacy is secured in the films he made, in the unforgettable characters he brought to life. And the story of his bitter relationship with John Wayne serves as a powerful reminder that even the biggest legends have their hidden battles, their unspoken resentments, and their very human reasons for utterly hating someone else, even another icon. The secrets of old Hollywood run deep, and sometimes knowing the reason why unveils a truth more dramatic than any movie plot.